The Kepler medical station smelled like antiseptic and broken dreams, which Jake Morrison supposed was appropriate given that he'd arrived with both an infected conscience and a career hanging by the thinnest possible thread. The orbital facility's pristine corridors stretched endlessly in all directions, their surfaces so clean they practically hummed with bureaucratic efficiency. Every step echoed with the hollow ring of military boots on polymer flooring, a sound that reminded him uncomfortably of funeral marches. Captain Morrison, reporting for mandatory psychological evaluation, he announced to the reception desk, though the words tasted like defeat in his mouth. The human clerk barely looked up from her holographic displays. Bay 7 Alpha. Follow the blue guidance lights. Your assigned medical officer will conduct the preliminary assessment. Jake followed the softly glowing pathway through corridors that seemed designed to make visitors feel as small and insignificant as possible. The medical station served as humanity's premier treatment facility for deep space personnel, which meant it specialized in fixing the kinds of problems that civilian doctors couldn't even pronounce. Combat stress, isolation psychosis, radiation exposure, alien pathogen contamination. If it could go wrong in the void between stars, someone here had probably seen it before. Bay 7 Alpha turned out to be a standard examination room equipped with enough monitoring equipment to analyze a patient's thoughts, dreams, and probably their childhood pet preferences. Jake had barely settled into the uncomfortable chair when his assigned medical officer entered, and his carefully maintained military composure immediately developed several significant structural flaws. She was Solani, which he'd expected from the personnel roster, but knowing something intellectually and experiencing it firsthand were entirely different categories of preparedness. Her ears swept upward in elegant curves that would have been striking on anyone, but combined with her graceful movements and the way she seemed to assess his emotional state with a single glance, the effect was profoundly unsettling. Captain Morrison, she said, her accent carrying the musical cadences of a language that had evolved under different stars. I am Kaya. I will be conducting your medical evaluation. Nurse Kaya, he replied, automatically defaulting to military formality as his defense mechanism of choice. Just Kaya, please. The Solani do not use titles in medical settings. We believe they create unnecessary barriers between healer and patient. Jake nodded, though he privately suspected that unnecessary barriers were exactly what he needed right now. The last thing his psychological evaluation required was a medical professional who specialized in emotional transparency. The preliminary assessment involved several standard procedures, Kaya continued, activating a series of holographic displays that materialized around his chair. Physical examination, psychological baseline establishment, and review of your recent mission reports. The mention of mission reports sent an unwelcome chill through his nervous system. The Titan 7 disaster had generated enough paperwork to deforest a small planet, most of it focused on the uncomfortable question of how a routine mining operation had resulted in 8 casualties and Jake's entire command philosophy requiring comprehensive reconstruction. The Titan 7 incident, Kaya said gently, apparently reading something in his biometric displays. I have reviewed the preliminary files. You lost crew members. 8 crew members, Jake corrected automatically. Petty Officer Williams, Engineer Thompson, Specialist Kumar, Navigator Davis, Medical Tech Rodriguez. He stopped abruptly, realizing he was reciting names like a litany of personal failures. You remember all their names. I remember everything about them. Their favorite foods, their families back on Earth, their dreams for after their service contracts ended. I remember every conversation, every joke, every complaint about the recycled air quality. His voice had begun to sound strange even to himself, hollow and distant. Kaya's hands moved across her diagnostic controls with practiced efficiency, but Jake noticed she was watching his face rather than her displays. The psychological evaluation process can be difficult for command personnel. Your species often associates emotional processing with weakness. Emotional processing, Jake repeated. Is that what we're calling it now? What would you call it? Failure analysis. After-action review. Comprehensive assessment of command decisions that got good people killed for absolutely no reason. The medical scanners hummed softly around him, presumably recording every elevated heartbeat and stress hormone spike for later analysis. Jake tried to maintain the kind of professional detachment that had gotten him through 15 years of military service, but something about Kaya's steady attention made his usual coping mechanisms feel inadequate. The preliminary reports indicate equipment failures and insufficient supply allocation, she said carefully. Standard bureaucratic cost-cutting measures that created cascading system failures. Standard bureaucratic cost-cutting measures, Jake echoed bitterly. That's one way to describe it. Another way would be that Central Command decided to save money on redundant life support systems and backup power supplies. Turned out those systems weren't quite as redundant as the accountants thought. You could not have predicted the equipment failures. I could have refused the mission. I could have demanded proper equipment inspections. I could have submitted formal complaints about the supply shortages instead of just grumbling about them over coffee. The words tumbled out faster than he'd intended, carrying months of suppressed anger and self-recrimination. Kaya made notes on her displays, but her expression remained neutral. Command personnel often struggle with decisions made under incomplete information. Incomplete information, Jake laughed, but the sound contained no humor whatsoever. That's generous. The information was complete, I just chose to ignore the parts that were inconvenient. 8 people died because their commanding officer prioritized mission completion over crew safety. The medical bay fell silent except for the soft hum of diagnostic equipment. Jake stared at his hands, noting abstractly that they were trembling slightly. When had that started? Captain Morrison, Kaya said quietly, when did you last allow yourself to process grief? The question hit him like decompression, sudden, violent, and completely destabilizing. Jake felt something crack inside his chest, a structural failure that had been building pressure for months. The tears came without warning, hot and embarrassing and utterly beyond his control. I'm sorry, he managed between ragged breaths. This is completely unprofessional. I should be able to handle a simple medical evaluation without. But Kaya had already moved, crossing the small room with fluid grace. Without saying a word, she settled into the chair beside his, close enough that he could sense her calm presence but far enough away to avoid making him feel trapped. She didn't offer platitudes or clinical reassurances. She simply sat beside him in the sterile medical bay, her silence more comforting than any words could have been, while Jake Morrison, veteran of 3 combat tours and commander of deep space operations, finally allowed himself to cry for the crew members he'd failed to bring home. The silence stretched between them like a bridge built from understanding rather than words, and Jake gradually became aware that his emotional breakdown wasn't being treated as a medical emergency requiring immediate intervention. Kaya remained perfectly still beside him, her presence somehow creating a pocket of calm in the sterile clinical environment. Her Solani empathic abilities, he realized, were probably allowing her to monitor his emotional state more accurately than any diagnostic scanner. This is highly irregular, Jake finally managed, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I don't think military psychological evaluations typically involve the medical officer providing emotional support. They do not, Kaya agreed calmly. Standard protocol would require me to document this episode and recommend immediate psychiatric intervention. But you're not following standard protocol. Standard protocol assumes that emotional expression equals psychological instability. My species has different perspectives on grief processing. She shifted slightly in her chair, her pointed ears twitching in what he was beginning to recognize as thoughtful consideration. Sometimes healing requires breaking regulations. Jake studied her profile, noting the way she seemed completely comfortable with their unconventional situation. You're going to get in trouble for this. Deviating from medical protocols, failing to follow proper documentation procedures. Possibly. But trouble is preferable to watching someone suffer unnecessarily. She turned to face him, her expression serious. Tell me about Petty Officer Williams. The request caught him off guard. Williams? Why Williams specifically? Because you mentioned her name first. In my experience, the first name spoken often carries the heaviest emotional weight. Jake leaned back in his chair, feeling oddly relieved to be discussing his crew rather than his failures. Williams was remarkable. 23 years old, signed up for deep space service to pay for her younger brother's medical treatment. She had this laugh that could lighten the mood in any situation, no matter how dire. Used to joke that she'd joined the space service because Earth's gravity was too demanding. She sounds like someone who brought joy to difficult circumstances. She brought hope. During the worst parts of long-haul missions, when everyone was tired and homesick and wondering why they'd ever left Earth's atmosphere, Williams would start telling stories about the ridiculous things her brother had gotten into back home. Suddenly the whole crew would be laughing instead of complaining. Kaya nodded, making notes on a handheld device that looked nothing like standard medical equipment. And during the Titan 7 incident, what happened to her? Jake's throat tightened. Life support failure in Section C. She was conducting routine maintenance when the primary atmospheric processor malfunctioned. I had to choose between sending a rescue team into a potentially unstable environment or sealing the section to protect the rest of the crew. What did you choose? I sent the rescue team. Williams and 2 others died when the secondary systems cascaded. If I'd sealed the section immediately, we'd have lost 1 crew member instead of 3. And if the rescue had succeeded? Then Williams would still be sending ridiculous messages to her brother and making everyone laugh during meal periods. Jake's voice cracked slightly. But it didn't succeed. My decision to risk additional lives for 1 person killed 3 people total. Kaya was quiet for a long moment, her empathic abilities apparently processing information that couldn't be measured by conventional medical instruments. Captain Morrison, may I share something about my own experience? Of course. Before joining medical services, I served as a combat medic during the Solani integration wars. My empathic abilities made me acutely aware of every injury, every fear, every moment of pain experienced by wounded soldiers. She paused, her ears drooping slightly. I lost count of the lives I couldn't save, but I remember each death with perfect emotional clarity. Jake felt a spark of recognition. Survivor's guilt. Survivor's guilt combined with empathic overload. For months after the war ended, I experienced every death as though I was dying myself. Traditional Solani healing methods proved inadequate, my people's usual approaches to trauma processing couldn't address the specific combination of empathic sensitivity and command responsibility. How did you recover? I learned that healing doesn't always require forgetting or moving past trauma. Sometimes it requires learning to carry the weight differently. Kaya's expression softened. Your grief for Williams and the others, it honors their memory. The problem isn't that you feel responsible, the problem is that you're processing that responsibility in isolation. Jake considered this, absently noting that his heart rate had stabilized and his breathing had returned to normal. The military doesn't exactly encourage collaborative grief processing. No, it encourages suppression and compartmentalization. Very effective for short-term operational requirements, very destructive for long-term psychological health. So what's your professional recommendation, Dr. Kaya? I am not a doctor, and my recommendation is highly unprofessional. She smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. I recommend that you continue talking about your crew members until discussing them brings comfort instead of pain. I recommend that you stop treating emotional expression as a command failure. And I recommend that you allow yourself to process grief with someone who understands command responsibility. Someone like you. Someone exactly like me, if you're amenable to irregular therapeutic approaches. Jake found himself smiling for the first time in months. Kaya, are you asking me to participate in unauthorized psychological counseling? I am suggesting that 2 individuals with complementary trauma experiences might benefit from collaborative emotional processing. The fact that this violates several medical protocols is merely an unfortunate bureaucratic detail. And if your supervisors discover this unauthorized collaboration? Then I will explain that human psychological recovery requires innovative approaches that transcend traditional medical boundaries. Also, I will point out that your vital signs have improved more in the past hour than they have in weeks of conventional treatment. Jake glanced at the monitoring displays, noting that his stress indicators had indeed dropped to levels he hadn't seen since before Titan 7. You're right. I feel different. More stable. Emotional stability often requires connection rather than isolation. Your species evolved as social creatures. Healing in complete solitude contradicts your fundamental psychological architecture. Is that your professional opinion or your personal observation? Kaya's ears twitched with what he was learning to recognize as suppressed amusement. Both. Also, I should mention that continuing this therapeutic approach will require regular sessions that may occasionally resemble personal conversations rather than medical consultations. I think I can handle that, Jake said, discovering that he was actually looking forward to their next meeting. Though I should warn you, I have absolutely no idea how to conduct collaborative emotional processing. Neither do I. But I suspect we'll figure it out together. For the first time since Titan 7, Jake Morrison felt like he might actually survive the weight of command responsibility. And for the first time since the integration wars, Kaya felt like her empathic abilities might be used for healing rather than merely documenting pain. 3 weeks into their unconventional therapeutic partnership, Jake had learned several important facts about collaborative emotional processing. First, Solani empathic abilities made it impossible to lie about your emotional state, which eliminated his usual strategy of claiming he was fine when he clearly wasn't. Second, Kaya's tendency to tilt her head when concentrating made her look impossibly endearing, which was creating complications he hadn't anticipated when agreeing to irregular counseling sessions. Third, the medical station's administrative staff was beginning to notice that Captain Morrison's psychological evaluation was taking significantly longer than standard protocol required. Commander Walsh wants to see me this afternoon, Kaya mentioned during their morning session, her ears betraying her concern despite her calm tone. Apparently, there have been questions about my treatment methods. Jake looked up from the cup of coffee he'd been systematically destroying with his nervous fidgeting. What kind of questions? The kind that involve reviewing security footage and analyzing time logs to determine why a routine psychological evaluation has extended into its 4th week with no formal documentation submitted. Ah. Jake set down his mangled coffee cup. That would be problematic. Problematic is an understatement. Medical personnel who deviate from established protocols without proper authorization typically find themselves reassigned to less prestigious positions. Often on mining stations with limited advancement opportunities. The thought of losing Kaya to bureaucratic oversight sent an unexpected jolt of panic through Jake's nervous system. Over the past weeks, their sessions had become the highlight of his day, a respite from nightmares, guilt, and the constant background noise of self-recrimination that had been his primary companion since Titan 7. Can you explain the therapeutic benefits? He asked. Document the improvements in my psychological baseline. I can try, but innovative treatment approaches require extensive justification, and my methods would be difficult to defend in a formal review. Kaya's expression grew troubled. The Solani approach to trauma processing emphasizes emotional connection and shared experience. Human medical protocols emphasize clinical detachment and measurable outcomes. And our approach combines both. Our approach defies easy categorization, which makes it either revolutionary or completely inappropriate, depending on your perspective. Jake considered this while watching her organize her notes with characteristic precision. The improvement in his mental state was undeniable. He was sleeping better, experiencing fewer flashbacks, and had actually laughed at something yesterday for the first time since the disaster. But quantifying the therapeutic value of sitting in comfortable silence with someone who understood command trauma seemed impossible. What if I formally requested you as my ongoing counselor? He suggested. Military personnel have the right to specify treatment preferences under certain circumstances. That would require admitting that you need ongoing psychological support, which could affect your command eligibility ratings. My command eligibility is already compromised. The preliminary evaluation results are probably going to ground me for months anyway. Kaya looked up from her notes, her empathic abilities apparently detecting something in his emotional state. You've accepted that possibility. I've accepted that commanding a starship requires better judgment than I demonstrated on Titan 7. Maybe a few months of psychological rehabilitation will help me develop that judgment. Or maybe, she said carefully, a few months of collaborative emotional processing will help you understand the difference between poor judgment and impossible circumstances. Their conversation was interrupted by Jake's personal communicator announcing an incoming message from his remaining crew members. The survivors from Titan 7 had been granted extended leave while the official investigation concluded, but they maintained regular contact through their informal support network. Captain, came Lieutenant Parker's voice through the speaker, we wanted to update you on Thompson's memorial service. His family specifically requested that you deliver the eulogy. Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it was accompanied by something he hadn't expected, a sense of honor rather than purely guilt. Thompson's family wants me to speak at his memorial. They said he wrote about you in his letters home. Apparently, he considered you the best commanding officer he'd ever served under, even after everything. Kaya watched Jake process this information, her expression thoughtful. After he'd acknowledged the message and closed the communication, she spoke quietly. How does it feel to learn that your crew member's family holds you in high regard? Confusing, Jake admitted. I killed their son through poor decision-making, but they want me to honor his memory. Perhaps they understand something about command responsibility that you're still learning. Which is that good leaders carry the weight of impossible decisions, and that carrying that weight honorably is more important than being perfect. Jake was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications. Kaya, if I attend Thompson's memorial service, will you come with me? Her ears perked up in surprise. As your medical officer? As my collaborative emotional processing partner. I think I'm going to need support, and you're the only person who understands what it feels like to carry responsibility for lives lost. That would be highly irregular. Medical personnel don't typically accompany patients to personal events. Everything about our therapeutic approach has been highly irregular. Besides, you said yourself that healing requires connection rather than isolation. Kaya considered this, her internal struggle visible in the way her ears shifted position. Commander Walsh is unlikely to approve such a request. Then we don't ask for approval. We submit a report after the fact explaining that your patient experienced a breakthrough during exposure to memorial services, and that your presence was essential for maintaining psychological stability. Captain Morrison, are you suggesting that we deliberately circumvent medical protocols? I'm suggesting that we prioritize effective treatment over bureaucratic compliance. Besides, what's the worst thing that could happen? They could reassign you to a mining station. They could reassign both of us to mining stations. Jake grinned, feeling more like his old self than he had in months. Then we'd better make sure our unauthorized treatment methods produce excellent results. Kaya's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on determined amusement. Very well. But if we're going to violate protocols, we should at least document the therapeutic rationale properly. And what would that rationale be? That sometimes the most effective healing happens when two people choose to support each other despite regulatory obstacles. She met his gaze directly. Also, that collaborative emotional processing works best when both participants are equally committed to the outcome. Jake felt something shift in his understanding of their relationship, a recognition that what had started as medical treatment had evolved into something deeper and more reciprocal. Equally committed to healing, you mean? Equally committed to healing, she agreed, but her slight smile suggested that healing might not be the only outcome they were both beginning to hope for. As they prepared to face Commander Walsh's administrative review together, Jake realized that for the first time since Titan 7, he was looking forward to the future rather than simply enduring the present. And judging by the way Kaya's ears had perked up with something that looked suspiciously like anticipation, she might be feeling the same way. The emergency klaxons began wailing just as Commander Walsh was preparing to deliver what Jake strongly suspected would be a career-ending lecture about protocol violations and unauthorized therapeutic partnerships. Instead of facing administrative consequences, they found themselves running toward Bay 12 where an incoming refugee transport was broadcasting distress signals that painted a picture of medical catastrophe and imminent system failure. Refugee ship Sanctuary, carrying 300 survivors from the Outer Rim conflicts, announced the station's emergency coordinator over the intercom. Multiple casualties, life support failing, requesting immediate medical assistance and emergency docking. Jake felt the familiar surge of command instincts, but this time the response was tempered by months of collaborative emotional processing rather than driven by desperate suppression of trauma. Commander Walsh, requesting permission to assist with emergency operations. Walsh looked between Jake and Kaya, clearly recognizing that their unusual therapeutic partnership had somehow produced a commanding officer who could function under pressure without psychological collapse. Permission granted. Kaya, you're assigned as primary medical coordinator. Morrison, you'll handle logistics and evacuation procedures. As they rushed toward the docking bay, Kaya matched Jake's pace with fluid grace, her medical equipment secured in a portable kit that looked designed for combat situations. Captain, are you prepared to make command decisions under stress? I think so, Jake replied, surprised by his own confidence. But I'm hoping I won't have to make them alone. You won't be alone. That was the entire point of collaborative emotional processing. The refugee ship Sanctuary was a converted freight hauler that had seen better decades, its hull scarred by weapon fire and its docking ports jury-rigged with equipment that definitely violated several safety regulations. As it settled into the station's emergency bay with mechanical groans that suggested structural integrity issues, Jake could see faces pressed against portholes, refugees who had survived the Outer Rim conflicts only to face potential death from equipment failure. Medical teams to stations, Kaya announced through her communicator, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to crisis management. Prepare for mass casualty processing and emergency life support assistance. Jake coordinated with the station's engineering teams to establish power connections and atmospheric stabilization, but his attention was split between technical requirements and the growing realization that this situation paralleled Titan VII in uncomfortable ways. Equipment failures, insufficient resources, desperate people depending on his decisions, the triggers for post-traumatic stress were unmistakable. Jake, Kaya said quietly, appearing beside him as he supervised power coupling connections, how are you processing this situation? It's familiar, he admitted, but different. I keep expecting the panic response, but instead I'm just focused. That's healing. Trauma processing allows you to learn from previous experiences rather than simply repeat them. The first refugees began emerging from the transport, a stream of exhausted families carrying improvised belongings and supporting wounded relatives. Jake found himself making rapid decisions about resource allocation and evacuation priorities, but this time he was consulting with Kaya and other team members rather than shouldering the entire burden alone. Captain Morrison, called Dr. Hayes, the station's chief medical officer, we have a critical decision. The transport's life support is failing faster than we can evacuate passengers. We can save everyone if we risk exposing our medical teams to potential atmospheric contamination, or we can ensure team safety but lose approximately 30 refugees. The parallels to Titan VII were exact: risk team members to save others, or prioritize known lives over potential casualties. Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but instead of paralyzing panic, he experienced something like focused clarity. Kaya, he said, what's your medical assessment? The atmospheric contamination appears to be particulate rather than biological. Protective equipment should be sufficient for limited exposure. Risk is manageable if we work quickly. Dr. Hayes, how quickly can we get protective gear to the medical teams? 5 minutes for basic protection, 15 minutes for comprehensive safety equipment. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, running calculations that included both risk assessment and the voices of his lost crew members. This time, though, those voices weren't accusations, they were reminders of why their sacrifice had meaning. We go with basic protection and work fast. All available personnel volunteer for exposure duty, no one is ordered into dangerous conditions. Medical teams work in pairs so no one makes decisions alone. The evacuation became a precisely coordinated dance of controlled risk and collaborative decision-making. Jake found himself working directly with refugees, carrying injured children and supporting elderly evacuees, while Kaya moved between medical stations like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of healing. "Captain," she called during a brief pause in the chaos, "the transport's final 30 passengers are trapped in a sealed compartment. We can cut through the hull, but it will destabilize their life support completely." "How long do they have?" "Maybe 10 minutes with current atmospheric levels." "How long to cut through safely?" 12 minutes. Jake felt the familiar weight of impossible choices, but this time he wasn't carrying it alone. Options: emergency atmospheric injection while we cut. Dangerous for the cutting team, but it might buy us the time we need. "I'll handle the injection system," Jake said immediately. "No," Kaya replied firmly. "We handle it together. Collaborative risk assessment, collaborative execution." They worked with synchronized precision, Kaya monitoring atmospheric levels while Jake operated the emergency injection equipment. The final 30 refugees emerged into safety with less than 2 minutes of life support remaining, and Jake realized he had successfully commanded a crisis response without psychological collapse. "Well done, Captain," Commander Walsh said as the last refugee was processed into medical care. "Your performance during this emergency was exemplary." "Thank you, sir." But the success was collaborative. Kaya's medical coordination and emotional support made effective decision-making possible. Walsh studied them both with the expression of someone revising his understanding of innovative therapeutic approaches. "Kaya, your treatment methods appear to have produced remarkable results. I'd like you to document your collaborative processing techniques for potential integration into standard trauma protocols." "Yes, sir. Though I should note that the approach requires long-term therapeutic partnerships rather than brief clinical interventions." "Long-term partnerships," Walsh repeated thoughtfully. "How long-term?" Jake and Kaya exchanged glances, both recognizing the question's broader implications. "Sir," Jake said carefully, "I believe my psychological recovery would benefit from ongoing collaborative processing with Kaya as my primary therapeutic partner." "Are you requesting permanent assignment modifications?" "I'm requesting permission to continue working with the person who taught me that command responsibility can be carried honorably rather than suffered in isolation." Walsh considered this for several moments while emergency teams completed their operations around them. The Deep Space Medical Exploration Program is launching next month. They need a commanding officer with crisis experience and a chief medical officer with innovative treatment approaches. Would you be interested in a joint assignment? Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since before Titan 7, excitement about the future. "Sir, are you offering us the opportunity to continue our collaborative approach on an exploration vessel?" "I'm offering you the opportunity to turn your irregular therapeutic partnership into a professional command team. The exploration program specifically seeks personnel who can function effectively under unprecedented conditions." Kaya's ears perked up with unmistakable enthusiasm. "Commander, we would be honored to serve together in that capacity." "Excellent. Consider yourselves reassigned pending final authorization." "And Kaya?" "Yes, sir. Whatever you've done to help Captain Morrison process his trauma, it works. I'd like you to develop training programs based on your methods." As they walked away from the emergency bay together, Jake realized that their journey from patient and caregiver to professional partners represented something unprecedented in both their careers. "Kaya, I think we accidentally revolutionized military psychological treatment. We revolutionized collaborative healing. The military applications are simply a beneficial side effect. And the personal applications?" She smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. "I believe the Solani term is silent guardian, someone who provides strength through presence rather than words. You have become my silent guardian, just as I became yours." Silent Guardian, Jake repeated, testing the words. I like that. It sounds like something worth being. It is the highest honor my people can bestow on someone who understands that healing happens through connection rather than isolation. Jake looked out at the stars visible through the station's observation ports, no longer seeing them as cold and distant but as destinations filled with possibility. So we're going to explore the galaxy together, providing collaborative emotional support and revolutionizing therapeutic approaches? Among other things, she agreed, her ears twitching with suppressed amusement. Though I suspect our mission reports will be quite unlike anything Fleet Command has previously received. How so? Try explaining to bureaucrats that your most effective command decisions resulted from collaborative emotional processing with your alien medical officer who sits beside you in silence during stressful situations. Jake laughed, the sound echoing through the corridor with genuine joy. They'll probably create an entirely new category of mission documentation, therapeutic command partnerships or something equally bureaucratic. Whatever they call it, will have proven that healing, whether individual or organizational, requires connection rather than isolation. Kaya paused at the intersection leading to their respective quarters. Jake, there's something I should tell you about the Silent Guardian designation. What's that? Among my people, it's not just a therapeutic relationship. It represents a bond that transcends professional categories. Silent Guardians are lifelong partners in every sense of the term. Jake felt his heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with post-traumatic stress and everything to do with possibilities he hadn't dared consider. Every sense. Every sense, she confirmed softly. If you're comfortable with that evolution of our collaborative partnership. He looked at her, this remarkable alien woman who had seen him at his most broken and chosen to sit beside him in silence until he could heal, and realized that somewhere between psychological evaluation and emergency rescue operations, he had fallen completely in love with both her strength and her compassion. Kaya, he said, taking her hand with fingers that were steady for the first time in months, I can't think of anything I'd be more comfortable with than spending the rest of my life as your silent guardian. Her smile could have powered the entire medical station. Then we should probably inform Commander Walsh that our therapeutic partnership has achieved complete success. Complete success. We have learned to carry impossible burdens together rather than suffer them alone. We have discovered that healing happens through connection. And we have proven that love, whether for lost crew members, traumatized patients, or each other, is not a weakness to be suppressed but a strength to be honored. As they walked toward their new future together, Jake Morrison realized that his journey from broken commanding officer to silent guardian had taught him the most important lesson of his career. Sometimes the most profound healing happens not through talking about pain, but through finding someone willing to sit beside you in silence until the pain transforms into something bearable, then meaningful, then ultimately into love.